You want to know the difference between right and wrong in heathenry? Well, there's a saga for that. Welcome to a deep dive into the Havamal. One of the things that sets heathenry apart from many other pagan traditions, and particularly ones influenced by Wicca, is that we have a very different approach to what is right and wrong, and why some actions may or may not be morally and ethically justified. At the most surface level, the obvious difference is around questions of force and violence. Heathenry, in comparison to spirituality derived from Wicca, tends to mostly be okay with the use of violence when it is justified and appropriate. There's also a lot of time given to topics like honor and being accountable to your word. When you blend all of that together, it's not hard for people to arrive at something that's very, Andrew Tate. If all you have are these general assumptions and ideas, then it's easy to arrive at a hyper-masculine image, especially when you take some of the different gods like Thor and Odin at face value and don't dig any deeper into the lore or the myth around these kind of figures. The deeper truth, which many find upon a little bit of work and exploration, is heathen ethics are very distinctly different, though not necessarily in a therefore that justifies being an extremely annoying broseph all the time who is constantly looking for opportunities to show off their supposed strength. As we're going to see shortly, there's a lot of depth and some really intricate through lines within pre-Christian Nordic philosophy, at least based on what we have that survives. And when it comes to ethics and morality, the one thing we've got is the Havamal. The Havamal is the longest of the sagas in the Poetic Edda. The fact that it's in the Edda suggests it was most likely compiled by non-Christian Icelanders, which is an important distinction to draw because much of the other saga material outside of the Poetic Edda was composed, compiled, and committed to page well after conversion at the behest of the aristocracy, which, by the way, was quite Christian. The Havamal is, without question, the longest of the sagas in the Poetic Edda, and it covers a lot of related topics, all of which in some way or another circle back to either examples of ethical conduct or more information about the god Odin. Even the title of the poem, The Sayings of the High One, is taken by many to be a reference to Odin, and the Havamal itself is often attributed to Odin himself. These are all reasons why the Havamal is one of the few things that heathens can really agree on as a foundation for ethical conduct and ethical philosophy. What also helps with that is the Havamal, as we'll soon get into, is quite comprehensive on these topics and gets into a lot of really important details. As I mentioned before, this lengthiest poem in the Poetic Edda is packed with a lot. It gets into a lot of the big moral and ethical dilemmas facing the peoples of this time and place. It gives a pretty decent reflection of what they probably felt as important. And what shows up here has echoes in other sagas, both within the Poetic Edda and later on, in the later saga materials and other similar works. I'm going to unpack this important text, as well as my particular takes and interpretations on it, as follows. First, I'm going to talk about the text itself, in terms of what it is we can see and determine just by looking at the document, how it's structured, as well as some other possibilities worth considering when discussing the Havamal. Next, I'll get into the main topics that it gets into, and how this saga is organized. After I discuss the main topics of the Havamal, I'm going to get into tone and style, and what that really tells us about how this stuff works, and what is particularly important within this ethical system, as well as some general themes within this system that show up from what and how things are covered. And then I will finish things up with a little bit of a recap and getting into the big takeaways that need to be considered. To start things off, I'm going to just get into the text itself. Now, the Havamal is a lengthy document. It runs 164 verses, making it easily the longest of the sagas within the Poetic Edda, and well over twice the length of the Voluspa, which is the famous one that gets into the end of the world and the creation of new worlds and Ragnarok and all that good stuff. There are, broadly speaking, at least 5 main segments of the Havamal, each of which are clearly different works referring to different topics. These 5 independent parts are the Gestathatar, or properly the Havamal, and that's the first 80 verses or so. It talks about proverbs, and particularly the name is translated as a guide for guests. And this is there because, well, there's a lot of stuff in there about hospitality, both as a host and as a guest. Following this is a bit of a derailment into some slightly misogynistic content, talking about the faithlessness of women in relationships, before then getting into Odin's failed wooing of the daughter of Billinger, and then stole the meat of poetry. The third section, which runs stanzas 111 to 138, is known as the Lodfafnismal, and that sort of does a similar thing to the Gestathatar. The difference here is that these verses are all directed at a figure known as Lodfafnir. This is then followed by the surprisingly short Runatal, the account of how Odin won the runes. This then introduces the Ljóðadal, which is a collection of spells that Odin, or at least the figure purporting to be Odin, claims to know. And some of these spells are pretty gnarly stuff. Poetically, the Havamal also gives us some great examples of several of the different verse forms. Although I wouldn't turn to any translations for examples, and that's not to knock any of the translators. All of them do incredible work. I use a combination of Bellows, Crawford, and a few others for getting my bearings and, comparing and contrasting different meanings. So what I'm saying is not to knock on the translations, but rather to point out that translating poetry is notoriously difficult. There are some examples of it being done very well, like Seamus Heaney's widely celebrated translation of Beowulf, which manages to beautifully both achieve linguistic accuracy and meet the poetic forms of Anglo-Saxon long-form epic poetry. What I'm saying here is a lot of translations tend to lean, understandably and justifiably, towards linguistic accuracy more than necessarily capturing the poetic style. So while you get a sense of these different verse forms, I recommend going to the original Old Norse verse to get a sense of what the verse structure looks like and how it works. This is where I have to get to something that's very important about the Havamal. It is quite clear from looking at the poem, the composition, the changes in verse form that happen, as well as the changes in subject matter, that this was composed by probably several different people. And the Havamal is most likely a compilation of at least 5 different poems that were all brought together under one title. This amalgamation doesn't discredit the Havamal in any way. I think it actually strengthens it by showing it as a reflection of the ideas and expectations of these peoples, that there are these common threads despite the differences between verses, verse form, and structure within the poem. What I'm getting at more is that this was not something that was just handed down literally as the dictation of Odin or something like that. It's clearly several different poems that were all brought together based on their shared coverage of material around Odin, and also quite possibly because in some ways the sayings of Odin or attributing things to Odin may have been a good way of signaling this is stuff that is considered to be wise and worth heeding. One possibility I'd like to throw out, and I want to say this is purely speculation on my part, so I'm absolutely open to and would welcome someone debunking this idea. What if the name of the saga is itself a kenning? That it is not literally, these are the sayings of the High One, but rather these are wise sayings that would be worthy of coming from Odin. That because they are associated with Odin, they are synonymous with wisdom and wise conduct. The title being a reference to that, rather than a literal, direct attribution to Odin, would work well with the fact that the Havamal is brought together from 5 different sagas, and that this is a body of poetry and a body of myth that really digs deep into kennings and indirect references and descriptive use of language. Now, again, this is just speculation on my part, but I think it's worth at least considering. When working in myth that is often indirect and descriptive, it is worth considering the unexpected angles. This brings the discussion to what's actually in the Havamal. And before I get into the nitty-gritty of what is ethically implied and discussed within this poem, I think it's important to take a brief detour into the land of philosophy for a moment, specifically ethical philosophy. Within modern ethical philosophy, there are several different categories of how philosophies are approached. And generally speaking, what these categories show is the inner workings of how that philosophy functions and how that particular concept of ethics works. One of the more common sets of ethical practice that exist in the world are what's referred to as virtue ethics. Now, this is something that everybody's probably encountered in some way or another, and to an extent, part of that is because many ethical philosophies, including this one, by the way, do signal to specific ideas or virtues as guides for behavior. Now, what makes virtue ethics a bit different from this general tendency is that within virtue ethics, adhering to the principles of a specific virtue, which may sometimes be actions, may sometimes not, may also mean holding to a specific thought or belief in a place of strong conviction, is what matters. What makes an action right is if it is being done in a virtuous fashion. This is sometimes also referred to as deontological ethics, which argues that certain actions are always morally justified, regardless of their impact on human welfare and their immediate consequences. Expressions like duty for duty's sake and virtue as its own reward are some great examples of this. The thing that's important to keep in mind about this particular kind of virtue ethics is it does establish certain absolutes. Some things are always right, some things are always wrong, regardless of circumstances. Immanuel Kant is a great example of this kind of ethical practice in that along with a lot of other things, he argued that lying or deceiving somebody is always wrong and always ethically unjustified. This is an example of what he calls the categorical imperative, which is the idea that specific commands or moral laws must always be followed, regardless of extenuating circumstances. Now, as you can imagine, something like, say, never lie could become a problem and could actually lead to moral situations that cause harm to other people, such as, for example, let's say you have to house your cousin Megan, who has just come in from out of state for a medical procedure, and that medical procedure is currently illegal in their home state. Now, let's say while cousin Megan is staying at your house, somebody from their home state rolls up and asks to speak with cousin Megan. Now, if you tell the truth, knowing that there's a bounty hunting law back in this state around this specific medical procedure, if you tell the truth and say cousin Megan is staying with you, then you are putting cousin Megan directly in harm's way. Now, I introduced all that because that's important to understand as the baseline that most of modern society tends to operate on. Because, as we're about to see, the Havamal really doesn't fit within the land of deontological and virtue-based ethics. If anything, the Havamal is what could be described as a bit existentialist in the sense of we create meaning through our actions, and also really consequentialist, which, in contrast to virtue-based ethics, argues the rightness of an action is based on its impact and consequences, as opposed to its adherence to specific abstract rules and norms. Now, this is not to say, as some might unfairly argue, that the Havamal specifically, or consequentialist ethics generally, argue for some kind of ends justify the means approach to ethics in life. I think what would be more accurate is, under a consequentialist framework, the ends are inseparable from the means, because the ends are a consequence of the means you use to make whatever the decision is and move through the particular situation. The Havamal, pretty much from the first word, is quite clearly operating within this kind of approach to ethics and philosophy. And that's apparent in how the different bits of advice and wisdom and information are conveyed within the poem. Pretty much every verse that offers anything even resembling advice or guidance does so from a very whether one should or should not do something kind of perspective, rather than what one must or must not do. Actions are framed not in terms of this is good because it is inherently good, but rather this is a worthy action because of the consequences and impacts it has on the world and on other people. A good example of this kind of logic can be found on verse 12, which is one of a few that talks about the topic of sobriety and the consumption of alcohol. As it says in the Bellows translation, "Less good there lies than most believe in ale for mortal men, for the more he drinks, the less does man of his mind the mastery hold." This is then juxtaposed later with verse 19, which says, "Shun not the mead, but drink in measure. Speak to the point, or be still. For rudeness none shall rightly blame thee, if soon thy bed thou seekest." So, both on its own, verse 12, as well as in conjunction with verse 19, you get what is more like sage advice than a what you must or must not do. There isn't any kind of absolute prohibition or statement saying, well, alcohol's bad, so don't do it. Instead, what you get is, well, be careful with this stuff. It can make you drunk and a fool and get you into trouble if you're not careful. This is further emphasized by verse 13, which reads, "Over beer the bird of forgetfulness broods, and steals the minds of men. with the hair and feathers fettered I lay, and in Gunnloth's house was held. Where it becomes especially apparent is in the Lodfafnismal, where many of the verses and segments begin with the following admonition. I read thee, Lodfafnir, and hear thou my rede. Profit thou hast if thou hearest, great thy gain if thou learnest. The Lodfafnismal then gives several examples of worthy versus unworthy conduct, circumstances that you should heed, and throughout it's framing these actions in terms of their impacts and consequences, rather than simply saying, well, this is good because it's good. It's usually saying things like, if you do this thing, it will be beneficial for you. Such as, for example, verse 16, which very bluntly says, if over the mountains or gulfs thou fain wouldst go, look well to thy food for the way. That's not a commandment. That's advice. That's a recommendation. Such advice and recommendations continue to be the tone and general thrust of what's in the Havamal. This is stuff that's being laid down as worthy wisdom and guidance because it's good ideas. Not because Odin says it to you and Odin says you should, but rather, if you do these things, it's generally a good idea, because if you don't do the thing or you do the opposite, it may have obvious negative consequences for you. In fact, the Lodfafnismal is the only place where you explicitly see the term evil show up, or anything similar, in the famous verses 127 and then 128, where 127 reads, if evil thou knowest, as evil proclaim it, and make no friendship with foes, followed by, in evil never joy shalt thou know, but glad the good shall make thee. Wicked is also a really popular one for referring to undesirable or otherwise unethical actions. But what's interesting is even though those words are used, they're used in a context of actions and what people are doing. Evil is not something one is. Evil is something one does. A person is wicked because they do wicked deeds, not because they are themselves a wicked individual. What is also very telling is nowhere does the Havamal suggest that certain innate traits or characteristics or anything like that suggest good or ill, which further enforces this idea of evil is something you do, not something you are. In fact, as one excellent example, and I bring this one up because at time of when the Poetic Edda was most likely compiled, physical disability and neurodivergence were absolutely seen as things like signs of the devil or ill favor or some kind of curse or something similar. We have Havamal 71. The lame rides a horse. The handless is herdsman. The deaf in battle is bold. The blind man is better than one that is burned. No good can come of a corpse. This sense of all life being precious, despite limitations like that, is further reinforced by the previous verse, 70, which reads, it is better to live than to lie a corpse. The live man catches the cow. I saw flames rise for the rich man's pyre, and before his door he lay dead. And by the way, that's not going to be the only one we're going to run into that takes a rather skeptical view of the virtues of wealth and material accumulation. This general theme of worthy actions with worthy consequences runs throughout the Havamal and sort of reinforces this idea of what makes a deed praiseworthy and ethical is the impact it has on the world around you and what it does for others, as well as what those deeds say about you. Two excellent verses that get into this are verses 48 and 16. 48 reads, The lives of the brave and noble are best. Sorrows they seldom feed, but the coward fear of all things feels, and gladly not the greedy gives. And 16, which further states, the sluggard believes they shall live forever, if the fight they face not, but age shall not grant them the gift of peace, though spears may spare their life. And of course, if I'm going to be talking about consequences, actions, and all of that as being critical for understanding the Havamal, then I of course have to get into verses 77 and 78, two of the most well-known and widely quoted from this saga, which read, cattle die, and kinsmen die, and so dies one's self, but a noble name will never die, if good renown one gets. And verse 78, cattle die, and kinsmen die, and so dies one's self. One thing now that never dies, the fame of a dead man's deeds. So let's talk a bit about that question of what the Havamal says about you and your fellow human beings. Now, right out the gate, one of the first things the Havamal gets into is hospitality. And oh boy, does it get into it at length and detail. The Havamal talks about both what you should do as a guest, as well as what you should do as a host. Like the rest of the saga, this is all phrased in terms of what is best for the person and what is best given the circumstances, rather than specific virtues or principles that have to be adhered to. Such as, for example, verses 3 and 4, which read, fire he needs who with frozen needs has come from the cold without. Food and clothes must the farer have, the man from the mountains come. Water and towels, and welcoming speech, should he find who comes to the feast. If renown they would get and again be greeted, wisely and well must they act. This is also what sets the context for that later stuff, talking about drunkenness, being wary in the hall, and being careful that one doesn't overstay their welcome. In fact, that specific concern is quite directly in the Havamal, which reads, verse 35, forth shall one go, nor stay as a guest in a single spot forever. Love becomes loathing if one sits by the hearth in another's home. There's also lots of warnings about not getting into fights with people, or if you're going to get into fights with people, you better be quick. There's even the flip side of what could be understood as saying something along the lines of fuck around and find out. Verse 31, wise a guest holds it to take to his heels. When mock of another he makes, but little he knows who laughs at the feast, though he mocks in the midst of his foes. So, if you're going to be dishing out those burns, you better be ready to either back them up or pack it up. Mixed within this advice is also quite a bit that talks about how critical it is to be in community with others and to be in friendship with others and what it takes to maintain those friendships. One of the most beautiful such examples, which is one that I absolutely love quoting at any opportunity, is Havamal 47. Young was I once, and wandered alone, and naught of the road I knew. Rich did I feel when a comrade I found, for man is man's delight. Which goes especially well with verse 52. No great thing needs a man to give, oft little will purchase praise. With half a loaf and a half-filled cup, a friend full fast I made. There's also a sense of that it's always better to have something and for peoples to have a means to care for themselves and be cared for. Such as verse 36, better a house though a hut it be, one is a master at home. A pair of goats and a thatched-up roof are better far than begging. Or, verse 37, better a house though a hut it be, one is a master at home. Their heart is bleeding who needs must beg, when food he fain would have. This also builds on earlier admonitions around speaking out and acting bravely and nobly, as well as speaking out against what is evil and wicked and doing something about those things. In fact, this emphasis on people's deeds circles back to a rather skeptical and critical view of wealth, such as, for example, verses 75 and 76. 75 reads, "A man knows not, if nothing he knows, that gold oft apes begets. One is wealthy and one is poor, yet scorn for them none should know." Followed shortly after by, "Among fit young's sons saw I well-stocked folds, now bear they the beggar's staff. Wealth is as swift as a winking eye, of friends the falsest it is." So in other words, don't put your trust in stuff and money, but in people, in relationships, and in your own wit and wisdom. What further adds to these examples are the general attitude of wariness and skepticism that exists within this poem. Now, there are some folks out there who have interpreted this as being borderline paranoid, but I think the context and circumstances under which these verses were composed pushes it as less paranoia and more, under certain circumstances, one should maybe act differently, be a bit more careful, and take some additional precautions. This further goes hand in hand with general admonitions and reminders that none are all wise, and everyone has limits to what it is they know and do not know. In fact, there is a verse that explicitly says this. Verse 53, "A little sand has a little sea, and small are the minds of men. Yet all men are not equal in wisdom, yet half-wise only are all." As is also fitting for the Havamal, the question of wisdom is one that is fraught with different possibilities and a little bit of that same kind of, well, sometimes this can be good, sometimes it can be bad sort of logic that we've already seen, such as the following verses, 54, "A measure of wisdom each man shall have, but never too much let him know. The fairest lives do those men live whose wisdom has wide grown." Followed by, "A measure of wisdom each man shall have, but never too much let them know. For the wise man's heart is seldom happy, if wisdom too great they have won." This also goes hand in hand with the general reminders of wariness. And I think wariness is the right word here, as it is something often misinterpreted as paranoia, which of course ignores the context of once you go out from settled, safe places in this world, you were taking a lot of risks. Life on the road was not exactly safe. Verse 1 of the Havamal gets into this right out the, gate, where it says, "Within the gates, ere one shall go, full warily let them watch. Full long let them look about them, for little they know where a foe may lurk, and sit in the seats within." Or, more pointedly, for a verse that has been used for all kinds of Second Amendment-oriented logic in the U.S., number 38. "Away from their arms in the open field, one should fare not afoot, for never they know when the need for a spear shall arise on the distant road." That context of distant road is pretty important there, because it establishes we're not talking sort of this generalized, I must always have my gun with me so that I could stand my ground in the event of somebody, I don't know, knocking on my front door and asking for help, or somebody driving my Uber and suddenly freaking out and thinking that I'm going to be kidnapped and trafficked to Mexico or what have you. This is specifically talking about being in a potentially dangerous situation of you are traveling the open road, which, when we're talking early medieval Europe, was not safe. Traveling put you at risk from the really mundane things, like what if you don't find shelter and you die of exposure? Or what if you didn't pack enough food? And hey, guess what? This is not a world where you can just pull off at the nearest off-ramp and get some cheap gas station snacks. And then there's the genuine dangers of things like what if you get robbed or ambushed on the road? In fact, you see, not in this region specifically, but in this period, earlier periods and later periods, a common boast of powerful rulers and particularly vast empires is how safe one could be when traveling within their borders. A couple centuries after this gets compiled, the Mongol ruler Ogadai Khan famously boasted that his vast empire was so safe that an unmarried woman could travel from one end of it to the other while balancing a pot of gold on her head, and no one would harm her. Roman emperors made similar boasts. So it really shouldn't be surprising that in this context, in the time and place that this is coming from, you're getting advice like this. Advice of, hey, guess what? If you're going out on the open road, which isn't always safe and has a lot of known risks, be careful. Keep your weapon ready in case you need it. It is also worth pointing out that when we're talking about this attitude of wariness and appropriate caution, and one might even say restraint, there's nothing that says you should just shut yourself up in your home and not take any risks or go out in the world. We've already gone over a couple of verses that get into that in more of a moral sense, but to deal with it in this context, we have examples like verse 10. A better burden may no one bear, for wanderings wide than wisdom. It is better than wealth in unknown ways, and in grief a refuge it gives. And further, in verse 5, wits must he have who wanders wide, but all is easy at home. At the witless one the wise shall wink, when among such people they sit. On the balance, what we have is a general pattern of skepticism, inquisitiveness, weighing information, and being appropriately cautious without allowing your fears to rule you. All of which is capped off beautifully by verse 18. They alone are aware who have wandered wide and far abroad have fared, how great a mind is guided by them that wealth of wisdom has. One thing that is consistent throughout the Havamal is it is not some kind of brosatru, brosif, overly masculine parody that one might assume it is based on all the self-proclaimed wolves of Valhalla running around on the internet. There's nothing in here, for example, that talks about going forth and getting yourself killed gloriously, or doing silly, ridiculous things to prove how mighty you are. In fact, there's even a verse that goes in the opposite direction. Verse 6. A man shall not boast of their keenness of mind, but keep it close to their breast. To the silent and wise does ill come seldom, when they go as a guest to a house. For a faster friend one never finds than wisdom tried and true. And it is worth noting, there are many, many verses like this that extol the virtues of wisdom and caution and restraint, and not very much that talks about what modern society would call stereotypical manly virtues. When you get down to it, the tone, the pacing, the content, and the approach has a lot less in common with various manosphere types, and is a lot closer to Albert Camus or Simone de Beauvoir. The examples of compassion for those who suffer, and the scorn that exists for wealth, its consistent depiction as an unreliable source at best, rather than a firm ally, especially compared to friends and relationships, sort of reinforces this. This is very much a text that goes in the direction of be cautious, be mindful of the consequences of your actions, speak out and act when you see something happening that you believe is wrong. And those with the greatest wisdom are wise because they've gone forth into the world. They've tested themselves, they've sought out new experiences, and expanded their understanding by trying new things and visiting different places and different peoples. I think it says something that not just the hyper-masculine types, but also the white nationalist sorts, tend to really gloss over that stuff, leave it behind, and don't really engage with it. It is, after all, hard to justify a white nationalist state on this foundation of go forth, meet other people, be mindful of the limitations of your knowledge, and always be looking for new experiences while being cautious and careful and not overestimating your own capabilities. Oh, and by the way, while you're traveling, be nice to your hosts, and if there are guests on your doorstep, let them in, give them towels and warm fires and good food, and treat them as you would wish to be treated as a guest in another home. If we were going to talk about immigration and borders policy from the Havamal, it would be really different from what it looks like right now. And it certainly wouldn't involve things like whole ships full of migrants capsizing and drowning because no one could be bothered to rescue them. One also gets the impression the corporate system that many of these folks implicitly or explicitly worship in their own way sort of doesn't really work well with all of this wealth is the falsest of friends talk. So where does this leave us? The Havamal, without any question, is vital for understanding heathen ethical and spiritual philosophy, both because it is the one example we have of non-Christian Nordic philosophy that has survived to the present day, and because it's one of the only things that heathens generally can agree on as being important. Its advice is succinct, measured, and also takes into account your circumstances, as well as the impacts of your choices. It doesn't establish any sense of absolute goods or absolute evils, and instead assigns wickedness and evil to actions rather than specific people or beings. I've said it a few times already, but it really bears repeating. Evil in the Havamal is something you do, not something you are. A fact that is reinforced by the, for the time, surprisingly forward-thinking verses about physical ability, anxiety, depression, and all these other kind of things. Above all else, it shows an ethical philosophy and an approach to right and wrong which emphasizes the consequences of your actions and makes actions inseparable from outcomes. Those who would cite the Havamal as a foundation for their moral philosophy should remember this. We are our deeds, and the renown we get from the deeds we do is the measure of who we are as people. Rightness is found in what is the most right action given circumstances, rather than in adherence to specific abstract values, which at times can lead to incredibly destructive and harmful outcomes. This is not to say ends justify the means, but instead to repeat that means and ends are inseparable. This is all couched in language that summarizes these ideas as guidelines, recommendations, worthy wisdom, rather than hard and fast rules that must be obeyed. The Havamal gives a view of ethical philosophy that puts the agency in the hands of every individual person. It is a lot of weight to carry, but with that burden also comes a greater degree of freedom. And that note concludes this episode about the Havamal. Thank you again for tuning in. This is Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer, now signing off. If you want to find out more about radical heathen practice, head on over to onblackwings.com, where you can find articles, classes, resources, and more. This podcast was created and produced by Ryan Smith. Thanks for listening.